Welcome back, chess fans. In today's episode, I will be giving you 43 different endgame principles that you need in order to take your endgame skills from a beginner to a near master level. This video will include some theoretical positions, but these positions will not be discussed in length, and some of them require their own separate videos. Also, this video is split into a couple of different parts, so you can skip around and watch the parts that you want to know about. Make sure to save this video in your playlists so you can always come back and revise these principles. Other than that, enjoy the video. Principle number 1, always push your passed pawns. So in this position, as you can see, white has an extra A pawn, and as it turns out, this is also a passed pawn because black does not have any A or B pawns in order to oppose it. So in this case, what we can do with the white pieces is just simply push this pawn. And because black cannot oppose this with a pawn, black will have to bring the king in order to attempt to stop it. However, if we simply continue to push the pawn, we will eventually queen because this black king is just not fast enough. It is unable to stop the passed pawn. So generally, whenever you're in an endgame, you want to make sure that your passed pawn is as far up as possible. But also you need to make sure you're not losing it, because if this black king was one tempo faster, for example, if we had played king to f2 earlier, the position is still winning. However, we need to be very careful because we would be losing this a pawn. So of course, in this case, king f2 is not a good move, but you always want to push your passed pawns, but you also want to use principle number 2, which we will get to in a second. So principle number 2 is always activate your king. Active king is what makes or breaks the position when it comes to endgames. So in this case, as you can see, the white king is on f2, black king is on h8, and it is almost as if white king is up 2 tempi. That is because if this king was on h1, the equivalent square of h8, imagine this white king got 2 free moves. It went to g1 and then it went to f2, and now it's white to move again, and this king can simply walk up the board, and this black king has to take longer. So in this case, after captures here, as we can see, we can go king e2 or king e3. In this case, that it doesn't even matter. King g8, we both bring our kings, but the black king is simply unable to stop this pawn, or stop this king, I should say. Principle number 3. Outside passed pawns are inherently more valuable than central passed pawns. That is because the black king has to travel a bigger distance. It has to go further away in order to try to win it. When we are in the opening phase of the game, the central pawns, such as the D and E pawns, they provide the most control over the center of the board, and they are the most valuable pawns in the opening phase. However, in the end game, it's actually the opposite. The central passed pawns would not be as good, but the outside pawns are more valuable if they are a passed pawn. And that is because of what I just said earlier. So in this position, as you can see, we can move the king to d4, and black king will eventually have to go pick up this pawn. If it just goes over here, we capture, and then we win all the pawns on the king side, and we will be up 2 pawns. But if black king tries to just hang around with a move like, let's say, king d6, not allowing us to do anything, no problem, we will simply continue pushing, and then once it goes over here, we capture, and then we will still win these 2 pawns on the king side. So outside passed pawns are more valuable than central passed pawns. Principle number 4, always centralize your pieces. So in this position, as you can see, the knight can jump to d4. Also, you could try to activate the king. That is also a reasonable option here. But the point that I'm trying to make is that if you were to play a move like knight to d4, the knight on d4 is simply more active than the knight on f3. Centralized pieces control the most squares, whatever that might be. That could be knight, bishop, rook, queen, does not matter. You need to centralize them in order to maximize their effectiveness. Principle number 5, try to put the enemy king in zugzwang. So in this position, if we were to play a move like king to f4, the black king has to make a move, but he does not really have a good choice because any move that he makes will give up something else. So for example, if this king goes to g6, the king no longer guards the e5 square. We can simply walk in and win this pawn on d5. But if the king goes the other way instead, we will go to g5 and we will win the h pawn instead. So try to put your opponent's king in zugzwang, and that will win you many games. Principle number 6 is try to outflank the enemy king. That means going in the opposite direction of your opponent's king. So let's say in this position, we want to bring the king to c2. Black also tries to bring the king. If we just simply continue to bring our king up, we're going to run into a problem because black will play king to d6, king c4, and king c6. And this is a very famous king and pawn endgame where it is a draw because black has the opposition. So instead of what you want to do in this position, let me go back, you want to go to b3 and then you want to go to a4. In this case, once we walk up even to a5, there is nothing that the black king can do, because if it goes king to b7 here, we are the ones taking an opposition. And remember earlier I said put the enemy king in zugzwang. This is also a form of a zugzwang, because if the enemy king goes to a7, we once again outflank the king, which means going in the opposite direction. We go to c6. If the enemy king goes to c7, we will go to a6. So we are simply outflanking this king, and the purpose of this is to win some control over some squares. And once the king goes here, or maybe even goes here, we can simply go to c7, and then we can push this pawn, but we have to be a little bit careful. You don't want to push b6, because that would be a stalemate. You can go with king to c6, and here go with like king to b6, taking the opposition once again. And this is how you're going to win this game, because once the king goes to c7, this move is a check, so you are not stalemating any longer. Principle number 7. King belongs in front of the pawns when it comes to king and pawn endgames. So whenever you're in such endgames where you're up a pawn and you're trying to convert this position into a win, you never want to lead the charge with a pawn. So for example, in this position, if you play a move like pawn to c5, you simply blunder a draw, because the black king will go back. Let's say you go king to d5, and then after king to d7, here black king has the opposition. So instead, what you want to do is lead the charge with the king. The correct move in this position is king to c5. This is the move that wins, and this is also an extension of what we talked about in the last principle. If the king goes to d7, we simply outflank the king. So remember, principle 7, king leads the charge. So principle number 8 is using pawns as a bait. So in this position, both white and black have 2 pawns each. However, white has a passed c pawn, and what we can do with this pawn is push it up to c5, and after king to c6, we cannot exactly go to e5 right away, because after captures, after a couple of moves, black actually gets back in time. But we can do this cool little maneuver where we go king to c4, black king goes back, and we basically win a tempo by doing this. We are one step closer. And after we go king to f5, captures, king to g6, we are going to win these 2 pawns. So we basically use this pawn that was a c pawn as a bait. We sacrificed it, but we were able to bring the king over here and win the rest of black's pawns. So principle number 9 is about using the queenside majority correctly in order to win these endgames. And also it is an extension of the last principle we talked about, where we use our pawns as a bait. So in this position, as you can see, white has 2 on 1 on this side of the board, which is the queen side, and black has 4 on 3 on this side of the board, which is the king side. However, this 4 on 3 is much more difficult to mobilize, and it takes much longer to push these pawns than these 2 pawns against this 1 pawn. So what will happen here is that white will push these pawns and eventually trade these pawns for the a pawn and create a passed pawn on this side of the board. So let's say these 2 pawns nullify each other, we will be left with a passed b pawn right here. Once that happens, the black king will have to walk all the way over to queen side in order to stop this pawn that's on the queen side, which will be a passed pawn. And once black king does that, white king will be free to walk on this side of the board over to the king side. Let me just use a different color arrows just to illustrate, and white king will be able to win all these pawns on the king side. So this is the theoretical idea of the queenside majority in chess. But of course, in practice, these pawns will be a bit more advanced than just simply sitting here on f7, g7, and h7. Principle number 10, the king is not always the most active in the center, and the position that you see on the board is was played by Akiba Rubinstein, in which he did not play king to d6 and bring the king closer to the center. Instead, he played king to f6, and the idea of this move is to go after the pawn on h2, because as you can see, these pawns, they're all clumped together, they're all defended. Well, not these two pawns, but it's very difficult to access. You cannot simply access a3, and you cannot simply access f2. If you try to, white will simply bring the king, and the position will end up being a draw, or in this case, it is apparently also a win. I'm not exactly sure why. However, the main point here is that after king to f6, the white king will also try to go over here to defend the pawn on h2. And you want to maximize the activity of your king. And the activity of your king is not maximized in the center of the board. In this case, it is actually maximized by being on h3. Sometimes the most active position for the king is going to be in the center. Sometimes the most active position for the king is going to be on the flank. Most of the time it's in the center, but this can also happen. So keep this in mind. This position is winning for the black pieces. So principle number 11, try not to get any backwards pawns. So in this position, as you can see, black king is more active than the white king. However, white is up 2 pawns. So you might think that in this position, okay, this is just very easily winning. Let me try to push b3 and a4 in order to create a passed pawn. However, if you play a move like b3, what black will play here is pawn to b4, and you cannot push a4 or c4 because of en passant. So if you try to push, black will simply take en passant, black will queen faster, and he will win the game. So in this case, you got 2 backwards pawns, and even though you're up 2 pawns, it doesn't mean anything. So you have to always be very careful when it comes to backwards pawns, and sometimes actually it's even better to play a move like pawn to a4, sacrificing the pawn completely in order to push the c pawn in this case. So you have to be very careful. Do not allow your opponents to give you a backwards pawn. Principle number 12. Whenever you have a flank pawn, you have to be very careful because some of these endgames can be drawn. So for example, in this position, if you just simply push the pawn and simply continue to push the pawn, what the black king will do is run to the corner here. Let's say you go king to h4. This black king will run all the way up here, and the position is a draw. So you want to make sure that the black king does not get in the corner, because if it does, theoretically there is no way to get rid of this king. The king will simply go back and forth, and you will end up stalemating him. So instead, what you want to do whenever you have a flank pawn, if you have the opportunity to do this, if you're trying to win, you want to push the king up, and actually push the king up as far as up to g7, because you do not want to allow your opponent to get over here. So you can start pushing. Let's say king to e7 is played. You don't even want to go h5 here because king f8. Remember, we're trying not to allow our opponent to get over here. So we play king g7 instead, and we are going to push this pawn all the way up and win the game. So remember, whenever you have a h or a pawn and you're trying to push it to a win, you need to make sure the king does not get in the corner, because if it does, then the position is a draw. So principle number 13, always look for breakthroughs. So in this case, you might think that the black is winning because black has a more active king than white. However, we can actually get a breakthrough here with these 3 pawns. So the move that's correct here is this move, pawn to b6. If a takes b6, we can push the pawn to c6. Now we are threatening to take the pawn on b7 and then queen on the next move. So the pawn on c6 has to be accepted, but once it is accepted, here we can push the a pawn to a6, and in 2 moves, a7 and a8 is unstoppable. White will get a queen much faster and white will win the game. This can be done the other way around as well. So for example, if the c pawn takes, here you do not want to push c6, here you want to push a6 instead, and after captures, c6, c7, c8, and white is winning. So always look for breakthroughs, even at a cost of a couple of pawns. Principle number 14, doubled pawns cannot always get a breakthrough. So in this position, both sides actually have 7 pawns, but the black has doubled f pawns. So this structure right here is Caro-Kann Tartakower structure, and the idea that I'm trying to show you is that these 2 pawns are actually quite ineffective when it comes to creating a passed pawn. So what will happen in positions like this is that both sides will push their pawns. Let's assume the kings are off the board here and both sides are just simply pushing the pawns. What white will try to do is push c4 and d5 in order to create a passed pawn, assuming the king is brought to the center first. But what black should try to do is instead try to create a passed pawn. The problem is, if these pawns are pushed up the board, there is going to be no breakthrough, because what white can do, white has already played h3 in this case, but if he hasn't, he will play h3, and he will also play f3. So let's say g4 is played, f3 by white, and now there is simply no way to break through this position, because if you push the pawn, the position gets locked, so there's no way to simply create a breakthrough. If you capture, white will capture back, and there's still no way to create a breakthrough, and black is effectively down a pawn. Principle number 15 is avoid isolated, double isolated, and backwards pawns. These are the least valuable type of pawns, and these types of pawns are what will lose you games most of the time. So whenever you're in positions like this, you want to make sure to avoid these structures as much as possible. As you can see, white's structure is very compact. All the pawns are together, lined up. There are no backwards pawns. Same on this side of the board. Black has a lot of weaknesses though, and if there are some pieces on the board, such as the rooks, these pawns will be significantly easier to target. Principle number 16, being up a pawn is not always winning, and if the pawns are on only one side of the board, it can be a draw. And when I say that, I mean it can. No, it's not always a draw, but sometimes it can be a draw. So for example, in this position, if the black king goes to f2, let's say king f4, there is simply no way to win this position. If you move the h pawn after captures, you know, we already talked about this. This position is a draw because the black king will simply run to the corner because it's the flank pawn, it's the h pawn. If for some reason g3 is played with a check after a couple of moves, you cannot simply mobilize these pawns and the position ends up being a draw, because if you ever try to go h4 or something like that, once again there is en passant, and this pawn is also threatening the queen. And even though in this case there is no flank pawn, which means that the pawn for white is a g pawn, it doesn't really matter because black will win it nonetheless. And if black doesn't win it, black will simply put you in opposition, and even if you are up a pawn, it is not going to matter. Now if we change the position a little bit, and instead of having the pawns on only one side, we have the pawns on both sides, such as position like this, now this is completely winning because we can bring the king. Black can also try to bring the king, although black cannot really do anything here. The position is just lost. And in this case, after captures, we once again use this pawn as a bait, while the white king walks all the way over to the queen side and devours these pawns. Principle number 17, you always want to have your rooks behind a passed pawn. that is the best placement for the rook, whether you're trying to win a position or whether you're trying to defend against an extra pawn. So in this case, if it is white to move, white will play a move like rook to a2 and then push this pawn as far as possible. If it's black to move, let me just waste a move with a move like rook e2, for example. Black will try to put the pawn, put the rook behind the pawn, same as white, but instead here black is of course trying to win this pawn. And the thing is, the rook can defend this pawn from the side. However, it is very ineffective from the side because you cannot mobilize this pawn. You cannot push it because you will always just simply lose the pawn. Black rook will capture it. So whenever you're trying to push a passed pawn in a rook endgame, make sure your rooks are behind to support it. If you are trying to defend against a passed pawn in a rook endgame, make sure your rook is still behind the pawn in order to not allow it to push forward. Principle number 18, a rook can defend against two passed pawns unless those passed pawns get to the 6th rank. So in this case, as you can see, the position is black to move. These two pawns are trying to become a queen. White's trying to push them. One of the pawns is on the 6th rank. One of the other pawn is on the 5th rank. So not both of the pawns are on the 6th rank. So in this case, black can actually defend the position with a move like rook to a3. This is the defensive technique, not rook b3. Rook b3 would lose the game to a7 and then b6. So this would not be very good, even though that's also not an easy difficult to win because of the extra pawns. Regardless though, in this case, what's going to happen here is that white will simply make a queen. But if you go rook to a3, now the b pawn cannot move because you would take the pawn on a6, and of course the a pawn cannot move because you would just simply take that. So you need the rook to be behind the most advanced pawn of white, which is the a6 pawn. So here this position is simply winning for the black pieces, because if you cannot move these two pawns, if you try to bring the king, the rook will go to a5. If you try to bring the king, now black can take, and if you try to push, once again rook will go behind the passed pawn and black is winning. However, if we change the position a little bit, like going back here, let me just waste a move for black. Let's say black just plays a very lazy move, rook to d3. In this case, white crosses but puts both of his pawns on the 6th rank, and now you cannot stop these pawns, because if you go to a3, then a7 will be pushed. If you go to b3, b7 will be pushed, and there's nothing you can do here because white can simply sacrifice the pawn and then queen the other one, and in this case black is also losing a rook. So remember, if you want to defend against the two pawns, make sure to not let them cross the 5th rank and get on the 6th rank. Principle number 19, always cut off your opponent's king, because this way you are destroying your opponent's activity, because the king cannot get in the game. So the correct move here in this position is this move rook to d7. This way, not only you're putting the rook on the 7th rank, attacking all the pawns, but you're also cutting off the black king, and then you're free to bring your king into the game. However, black is struggling a lot, and in a lot of these positions, even though this specific position is holdable by the computer, according to the computer it's plus 0.4 only. However, from a human perspective, this is extremely dangerous, and you are very likely to win these games because of how much pressure you're putting on your opponent. So make sure to always cut off your opponent's king. Principle number 20, and this is one of my favorite principles in chess. Whenever you're trying to win the game, you want to make sure the pawns are still on the board. Whenever you're trying to draw the game, you want to make sure to trade off as many pawns as possible. So in this position, black's last move was this move pawn to a6, and here you have to make a decision. Do you go b6 or do you take on a6? And according to this principle, the best move, and the best move objectively, is pawn to b6. You want to keep the pawns on the board as long as you're trying to win the position. For black would actually benefit from you taking on a6 because black gets rid of one of your pawns. In this case, it's still winning for the white pieces. However, if black manages to mobilize these pawns as well and trades off one of his kingside pawns for the g pawn, this position will simply turn into a draw because rook and a bishop cannot win against the rook, especially with 2 extra pawns. So that position would simply be a draw. So make sure if you're trying to win, keep the pawns on the board. If you're trying to draw, trade off all the pawns. Principle number 21, push the passed pawns as much as possible, even if you cannot queen them right away. That means in this position, you should play this move pawn to a5 and then pawn to a6. Even though this pawn is blockaded on a7, the black rook is blockading it, so it cannot move forward, it is still more valuable than if you kept the pawn on this square on a4. The pawns that are more advanced are restricting your pieces, because if, like, let's say you were to play king to e3 here and black plays a move like rook a5, now you cannot even cross the 5th rank. But if you start pushing the pawn, black can play rook a6, but let's say black brings the king instead, you push the pawn to a6, this becomes more dangerous for the black pieces. So the pawns that are further advanced are naturally more dangerous than the pawns that are not as far advanced, even if they are blockaded. This is especially true in the rook endgames. However, it can be true in other endgames as well. In queen endgames, for example, it is very true. In minor piece, knights and bishop endgames, it is debatable, it is very situational, but generally it holds true in the rook endgames. Principle number 22, hanging pawns and also isolated pawns get weaker in the endgame. So as you can see in this position, black has the hanging pawn structure, while white has the normal structure that white usually has. And in this position, white is slightly better. Why is that? That's because white has a lot of targets. For example, there's this target on c6, but white also has this target on a7. So you can go rook to c5, and at any moment you can go rook a5 to pressure this pawn on a7. So you have tangible targets, while black cannot target anybody. If it goes to b8, you would simply be looking at this very defended pawn on b3. If you go to e8, you would simply be looking at this very defended pawn on e3. So there's nothing you can do here, and also you would just simply lose a pawn. So you guys need to make sure whenever you're playing against the hanging pawns, you want to trade off the pieces and try to play against these pawns in an endgame. And the same thing goes for an isolated pawn. In this position, we have a tangible target as the white pieces, because this pawn is only defended by the rook, but the black rook does not have any tangible targets, and it is quite easy to mess up this position with the black pieces. So make sure to go into an endgame when you're playing an isolated pawn structure or the hanging pawn structure. Principle number 23, pawns together are very strong and pawns that are split apart are very, very weak. So in this position, as you can see, it's equal material. However, white, once again, similar to the last position, has tangible targets. White can play a move like rook to c5, attacking this pawn, and even though let's say this rook can defend, you can always swing this rook to a5. You don't have to do it right away. It could actually be better just very simply to bring the king. But the main point is that if there are pawns that are split apart, they're just targets. But the pawns that are together, they're very firm, very solid, and it is difficult to break through. Principle number 24, if you are trying to win a position, you want to trade off one pair of rooks, maybe even both, but at least one pair. So in this position, the correct move is either rook a to c8 or rook f to c8. It doesn't really matter which one. I'll just bring the a rook to c8. And in this case, Which side benefits from this trade if an exchange happens on the C file? It's the black pieces. The reason for that is because you're getting rid of one pair of rooks. And this is important because if you just simply maintain both rooks on the board, your opponents are more likely to generate counterplay with their pieces. But if you're only left with one set of rooks, then it's much easier to win these positions. So make sure to always trade off one pair of rooks if you are trying to win a position. Principle number 25. Knight endgames are closest to pawn endgames, and if a pawn endgame is winning, if you throw in two knights in the position, it will also be winning. So on the screen, you can see the position that we already discussed earlier, where we said we needed to push the pawn here. This was the very first principal position. We also threw in two knights though, so we have the exact same position, but with the knights, and this is also winning. And you're going to notice that these endgames are actually not only they're similar to king and pawn endgames. They're actually in some ways easier than king and pawn endgames because these knights can simply waste tempi as much as possible. So a lot of techniques such as opposition, triangulation, and all those things, they're not really relevant when there are knights still on the board. So in a weird way, having knights in an endgame could be easier than just a very normal king and pawn endgame. So principle number 25, knight endgames are the closest to pawn endgames. If a knight endgame is winning, or if a pawn endgame is winning, the knight endgame in a similar structure will also be winning. Principle number 26, king dominates the knight if they are one square apart diagonally and two squares apart from the side, either vertically or horizontally. So in this position, as you can see, the knight and the king are sort of not really facing each other, but they're apart one square diagonally. That means that the knight is severely restricted by the king. It cannot access any of these squares. And if the knight were to jump, let's say well, let me push the pawn because it's white to move. If the knight jumps to a square like c7 and becomes two squares apart from the side, this is also a way that the king dominates the knight because the knight cannot jump forward. If the knight goes other way, this is a move that makes a bit more sense than knight c7, of course. You just simply continue to push the pawn, and you can see how this king is very strong, despite black being up a full knight, not even just knight and down some pawns. Black is up a full knight here. Both sides have 4 pawns, but black has a full knight. But the difference is this knight cannot really do anything because the king restricts it so well. So remember, knight is ineffective against the king one square apart diagonally and 2 squares apart from the side, vertically or horizontally. Principle number 27. When you're in the same color bishop endgame, you want to fix the pawns on the same color as your opponent's bishop. So in this position, as you can see, both sides have light square bishops, both sides have pawns pushed. However, in this position, it's white to move, and the way you play this position for an advantage and try to push this for a win is you need to push, you need to play moves like b4. And what this does, this is not necessarily the best move right away, but I just want to highlight the idea. What this does is it pushes the pawn and fixes the structure. Fixing a structure means when the enemy pawns cannot move forward, because a5 cannot be moved because you just simply take it. The b pawn is blocked physically. So the pawns are fixed on light squares, and this is exactly what we want, because if black attacks the pawn on a2, for example, we can even move this pawn to a3, and the problem for black is these pawns can simply never be targeted by this light square bishop, but our opponent's pawns on a6 and b5 can be easily targeted by our bishop, even if it's defended with a move like bishop c8, for example. They're still targets. This bishop is tied down to the defense of these pawns, so this is what we want to do. We want to fix the pawns on the same color as our opponent's bishop. Principle number 28, opposite color bishops can be a draw despite your opponent being not only up 1, not 2, but even 3 pawns in some cases. So in this position, as you can see, black has 3 extra pawns. Black also has a dark square bishop. We have a light square bishop, but we also have a slightly more active king. And what we can do here is simply just go king f5. and blockade all of these pawns. If any of these pawns move forward, of course we can take them, and here we will go bishop to d5, and our goal here is to maintain the control of these light squares, this diagonal and also the long diagonal, because the pawns will be pushed here, and we need to maintain the control over this whole diagonal so we control all the pawn pushes. Of course, black will still try to push this for an advantage here. For example, black might try to sacrifice this pawn on f6, like play king d7, for example. We capture the pawn, and then black can try to bring the king over here. But of course, there are ways to mitigate this as well and just hold the position. It is a matter of technique, but the idea still stands that opposite color bishops are drawn most of the time. Principle number 29. If you're trying to push pawns in an opposite color pawn endgame and you have two connected passed pawns, you want to push these pawns on the same color as your opponent's bishop. So in this position, black is the one pushing for a win because black has the extra pawns, and black has the dark square bishop, white has the light square bishop. So what does black want to do? Black wants to push the pawn on his opponent's color complex. So he wants to push the pawns on light squares. So in this case, the correct winning move here is pawn to b3, and then of course the king would come closer, and then from there it's quite easy. You just go a3, a2. However, if you were to push the a pawn instead, this immediately draws the game, because after a move like king to c2, the bishop is controlling the light squares extremely well, and black simply cannot fight for these light squares, and the position ends up being a draw. That's why you need to push on the light squares, because when you push on the light squares, your pawns fight on the light squares and your bishop fights on the dark squares. So it allows you to fight on both color complexes, but if you push on the dark squares, the position can turn into a draw. So make sure to push on the same color as your opponent's bishop. Principle number 20, opposite color bishops are not always drawn, especially when there are still rooks on the board. So for example, in this position, as you can see, it's opposite color bishops, the material is the same, but there are also rooks still remaining on the board. And even though this position is not completely winning by any means, you can still put a lot of pressure on your opponent with moves like rook to c8, for example, forcing this bishop back and putting the bishop on c4, and potentially targeting f7, going e5 at some point in order to go king e4 and bring the king closer to the center. And you can put a lot of pressure on the opponent by playing moves like this. And whenever you're in an endgame like this, mainly you just want to target your opponent's weak squares. In this case, this and this are kind of weak. And I understand that they might be defended by the rook, but that means the rook has to be tied down to the defense of these pawns, and it's not very mobile if that's the case. So in this case, you would play moves like, as I said, bishop c4, bring the king, f5, e6, and then you can put a lot of pressure on the black position. Principle number 31. Bishops can be better than the knights if there are pawns on both sides of the board. So in this position, as you can see, there are pawns on both the king side right here and also the queen side. So what does this mean whenever we have a dynamic such as bishop versus knight? Well, bishop is a long-range piece. It can control a whole diagonal and the whole side of the board from far away, while the knight has to travel a bit longer in order to do that. And this can be a slight advantage, and in some cases a big advantage, whenever it comes to endgames. So for example, in this position, there is no way for this knight to do anything remotely special to white's position. However, white instead can put a lot of pressure on the black position with moves like a5, a6, for example, putting pressure on this diagonal. And if that happens, nobody can really stop this, because if a move like king to f8 is played, a6, how do you defend these pawns? You have to maybe capture the pawn, and after bishop takes c6, remember earlier we talked about how doubled pawns sometimes cannot break through the position. Well, we have effectively achieved an extra pawn here at the extra c pawn. So there are some cases where bishops can be better than the knights, and when there are pawns on both sides of the board, that is usually the case. Principle number 32, if you have an extra pawn that's on the edge of the board, which means an A pawn or the H pawn, and you have a bishop, these positions can sometimes be drawn if the promotion square is the opposite color of the bishop. So right here, we have a light square bishop, and this right here is a dark square. It's a dark promotion square for the pawn. That means that this position is a draw. There's no way theoretically to win this position. Black will simply go back and forth. If we move the bishop, black will just simply go back and forth. If we move the bishop to d5 and go to this diagonal, does not matter. Black will go to h7 and then go back to h8. So black will simply move back and forth. If we try to push the pawn, we will simply end up stalemating our opponents. Principle number 33, bishop dominates the knight when it's 2 squares away from the knight. So in this position, white is completely winning, even though white is actually down a pawn, and the correct move here is this move, bishop to d4. What this does is it basically traps the knight on the edge of the board. This is not a very common idea, but it is that the threat of this is quite common in a lot of positions when the knight goes to the edge and it gets trapped by the bishop. And as you can see, all the forward knight jumps, all the squares that knight can go to are dominated by the bishop. And there's nothing black can do. White will simply bring the king and pick up this knight. Principle number 34, knights can be better than bishops in an endgame if they're on an outpost or if the position is very close. So in this case, it's not a very close position, it's sort of like a semi-closed position. And also, knight is on an outpost. It's on a light square outpost, and the bishop is simply unable to do anything against it because it cannot take this knight ever, and this knight has free control of all of these squares, and the bishop has to stay on d8, stay passive, while white brings the king and slowly improves the position. So there are some cases where even if there are pawns on all sides of the board, if a knight is on a very nice square, such as d5 in this case, the knight can be better than the bishop. Principle number 35, bishop pair is an advantage. If you have the two bishops against a bishop and a knight, this will always be considered slightly better than bishop and the knight itself, and you should take advantage of it. Of course, you have to follow all the other principles as well, activate the king, bring it to the center, but you always need to use your bishops effectively to try to restrict your opponent's pieces. That means potentially putting the bishop on f3, 2 squares away from the knight, to dominate all the forward knight jumps because it's controlled by the bishop, and also bringing your king to try to access all of these weak squares over here. So the bishop pair is considered at least a minor advantage in endgames, but it could also be a big advantage depending on the position. Principle number 36, in queen endgames, the quality of pawns matters significantly more than the quantity of the pawns. So in this case, white is actually down a pawn, but white is completely winning because of this very, very strong a6 pawn. And a very simple way to win this endgame is to put the queen on b7, where we are threatening this queen on c8. The queen has to move, but let's say queen goes just somewhere, it doesn't matter where. The problem for black here is that the whole diagonal is covered by the queen, so there's no ways to give a check here, and this pawn just has a free red carpet, so it can just go up, queen, and white is winning. Now, on the same note, this position can easily end in a draw, and let me go back here. For example, let's say you don't see this move, queen b7. Okay, let me try to put the queen behind the passed pawn in order to try to push it, because you cannot push it right away because there's a check, right? The pawn will be lost. But let's say you play a move like queen a5 to try to push this pawn. Unfortunately, after queen c6, king f1, and then queen h1, the position is a draw because no matter what we do, the queen will always find a way to give us checks, and the position ends up in a perpetual. Principle number 38 is don't actually be afraid to bring out your king in the queen endgame if you calculate precisely and if you are actually able to foresee that there is no perpetual in the position it can actually be beneficial to bring the king out. And the reason for that is because if your opponent keeps giving you checks with the queen, you can try to walk your king towards your queen. So you just walk the king up. Let me just keep giving checks here. You just keep walking the king up, check. But at some point you will be able to block these checks. As you can see, you can block these checks, and in some cases, let's say queen to f7 is played, you can even force your opponent to trade queens. Now, of course, some of your opponents will be a bit more precise than what I showed you, but the point is that in a lot of positions, in a lot of queen endgames, the queen can shield the king and also force a queen trade. And even if the queen trade is not forced, let's say black is a bit more precise, you are still going to find ways to wiggle out of all the checks. Let's say queen takes g3 here. Now you give queen c7 check, and this forces an exchange of the queens because it's a check. Next move, you will queen and win the game. Principle number 39, you need to remember the staircase technique if you're trying to win queen against a passed pawn that is about to queen itself. So the way you win an endgame like this is you need to either end up on this square on e1 or bring the king with checks. And the way you do it is you keep giving checks and you also threaten to win the pawn. The king has to defend, you keep getting closer, you keep getting closer, and eventually you will get to squares like f3 where you're threatening the pawn and you're also giving a check. If the king goes in front of the pawn, you will simply bring the white king. The black king will try to move out of the way and try to queen once again. But as I said, you keep giving checks, you keep threatening the pawn, and then eventually black has to block the square in front of the pawn again, and once it does, you will bring the king. This is called the I believe it's called the staircase technique. I'm not actually sure if that's the actual name of this, but this is basically the correct technique to win these endgames. Principle number 40, rook versus bishop endgame is a draw. So in this case, as you can see, white has an extra exchange. So white has a rook, black has a bishop, but this position is simply drawn, and theoretically there is no way to win this. But the correct drawing technique is to run the black king into this corner on h1, into the light square corner. Be very careful because you want to go to the opposite color corner of your bishop. You have a dark square bishop, so you want to run to a light square corner. If you had a light square bishop, then you would want to run to a dark square corner, and that is how you would try to draw the game. So this game could go something like, let's say, rook to c4. Of course, you cannot just simply run right now because you would lose the bishop. You have to be a bit more precise than that. You just attack it, attack the rook, king defends, and then you just bring the bishop back, and slowly you will make your way towards the corner. Principle number 41, rook versus a knight is also a draw only if the king and the knight stay together. And this is very important because you have to be very careful when you have a knight because it can get isolated from the king. So for example, if the king comes closer and you start playing moves like knight to f5 here, it's still a draw, but let's say after rook threatens the knight, you just go further away. Now the position is completely lost because there's no way for you to actually save the knight anymore. Like knight to b6, for example, you will go rook to b4. Or sorry, that's not b6, that is g6. You will go rook g4, and the position is simply winning because all the knight jumps are pretty much dominated. The knight has to run to the corner, and from here it's very easy. You can play rook b7, and now all the knight jumps are controlled. So this position is simply completely winning for the white pieces. So the technique here for black is to keep the king and the knight together, so they will always remain together. You can keep giving as many checks as you want, but the position will always be a draw as long as these two are together. So principle number 42, when there are still pawns on the board, you can sacrifice the rook for the piece. It actually doesn't matter whether there is a knight here or the bishop. You can sacrifice the rook for the piece and a pawn to end up in a winning endgame. So in this case, you can just simply capture this knight, and after captures, this position is completely winning for the white pieces. But the thing is, you remember earlier we were talking about if you're trying to win a position, you want to keep the pawns on the board. If you are trying to draw the position, you actually want to trade off all the pawns. Well, if this position did not have any pawns on the board, black would be able to defend it if black managed to play a move like knight to c8, or just keep the king and the knight together. That would be the drawing technique that we just talked about also. But because there are still pawns on the board, these endgames are always winning for the side that has the rook. And finally, principle number 43 is about rook versus two minor pieces, such as bishop and a knight. And traditional knowledge tells us that rook is worse than the two pieces. However, there are some cases where rook actually can be better than the two pieces if you have an appropriate position. Like, for example, here, after rook to d8, king f7, rook to c8, you're actually threatening to infiltrate with rook c7, and this is pretty much unstoppable. You are infiltrating and winning another pawn. And this is what matters most. Whenever you have a rook versus two pieces, if you can control all the entry squares of the rook, usually it's either going to be a draw or better for the side that has the two pieces. However, if the rook can actually go in and infiltrate, then the two pieces might have some trouble trying to stop that rook. And let me actually show you a position where two pieces are actually very stronger. So it is actually a very similar position, except there's no knight on e5. In this case, there's a bishop on c7, and this position is actually minus 1.4. The earlier position was like plus 1.4. So this position is completely winning for black because all the entry squares are covered by the bishops, and also this shows the strength of the bishop pair as well. And all the entry squares are covered, the rook cannot infiltrate, and therefore the position is winning for the black pieces. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Let me know in the comments if you guys like these kinds of videos, and I will surely upload more. And for now, I will see you in the next one. Peace!